The residents of Racine, Wisconsin, were startled when the body of Darby Wagner Richardson was discovered near her workplace, showing signs of a gruesome attack. She had been manually strangled to the point of near decapitation. Who could commit such a brutal act? And what was their motive? The locals were certain of who the culprit was, yet he roamed free. This man had faced multiple allegations of assault and mistreatment, but had evaded conviction. How many more lives had to be stolen before the perpetrator was held accountable? Ruth Elaine Wagner was born in Watertown Township, Blue River, Wisconsin, and moved to Boscobel with her parents. She was raised on a farm in Wisconsin's wild turkey hunting capital and got hitched to her high school lover, Robert Linder. They had 2 kids together, Deborah and Byron. On May 2, 1958, Deborah was born in Boscobel. She was wholeheartedly beloved by her grandparents, Bertha and Harry Wagner. They affectionately referred to her as Derby, and the nickname stayed. Darby, who was born barely a year after her teenage parents were married, has had a difficult life from the start. Her dad, Robert Linder, was in the Army. Therefore, the family would frequently have to relocate. He was young back then, and this was the only way he could make a living while also providing for his growing family. Darby never felt entirely home in a particular neighborhood and struggled with making friends until she was nearly 9 years old. In May 1967, her parents had a bitter separation, and her mother eventually moved to Madison. Ruth Wagner remained single for a long time, dedicating herself to looking after her kids, but she discovered love again in 1974, marrying James Erickson. Darby was frustrated over her parents' separation. When she reached the age of 14, she chose to leave her home. Back home, her mom had once again divorced and then remarried in 1986. Darby had no idea about that, as she was preoccupied with her own life. Douglas Coppin entered the life of Darby's mom, and she later had 2 step-siblings named Daniel and Alan Coppin. She also had a baby sister named Gina Coppin. Her family had increased in number, yet she felt alone and excluded. She decided to start a new life because she felt left out by her mom. 2 years after fleeing from her mom's house, Darby stepped into a bar in Racine. She happened to meet the owner of the bar, Fred Wagner Richardson, and like a typical naive teenager, felt attracted towards his bad boy demeanor. The 30-year-old had a lot of experience. He had enlisted in the United States Army using a fake name, which impressed young Derby. What she did not realize was that this man was bad news. He had a lengthy history of violations and misconduct during his service. During his military service, he reportedly jumped out of the bushes, attacking and robbing a man. As a result, he served time in prison and was given a dishonorable discharge. Then he moved to Racine, and there was convicted of 2 more robberies. He only completed a fraction of a 15-year term. The criminal justice system was the only reason he was permitted to walk the streets with such freedom. Criminals can get away with minor violations of the law. When he was freed from Leavenworth jail, he chose to settle in Racine. Racine was an average industrial town, and it presented Fred with the opportunity he sought. There he opened up a bar and was met with Darby, who was 16 years old at the time. Fred Wagner was a clever man. He may have been a criminal all his life, but via his cleverness and scams, he had owned a few rental homes within the town. They were mostly low-income housing units. He was reputed for being cutthroat in his business affairs as well as his private relations. His dealings were strictly based on verified info and was very calculating when it came to money. Fred offered to hire her as a performer in his bar. For years, being a minor, she kept pretending while dancing for tips. She had no idea how to defend herself, and this was the first job that compensated her enough to be able to afford a moderately better lifestyle. Legally, Fred couldn't have hired her because she was a minor, so he manipulated her and took advantage of her. In exchange for her services, he likewise provided her with a refuge as he owned rental houses. From the very start, he was able to maintain control over her. She considered him her savior, but in actuality, he was just manipulating her. In the year 1979, Derby and Fred were married. They had 2 children, August and Joy Wagner, born in 1980 and 1984, respectively. By that time, Derby had her mom, Ruth, met with her family. Ruth had doubts about Fred from the beginning. Over time, Fred became increasingly dominant in their relationship. Several of Derby's friends and colleagues were aware of the couple's relationship problems. After the couple's first honeymoon time frame, Derby soon came to the realization that she was stuck in an abusive marriage. Whenever Fred got upset, he became too aggressive and dominating. She had been repeatedly abused ever since their marriage, whilst she was a teenager, until she was able to develop her own strength and deal with it. Her friend and colleague Kelly Williams Cherry would frequently babysit the couple's young daughters. Derby spoke with Kelly and others about how Fred used to constantly mistreat her. Finally, in June 1986, Derby mustered up the courage and left Fred. After struggling with years of a troubled marriage, she finally took action. Derby was likewise fast to initiate legal proceedings after receiving advice from friends and lawyers. Despite Fred's aggressive reply, she stood firm and refused to back down. She filed for divorce in December 1986. The couple owned a number of properties in Racine that were to be split. Fred feared the possibility of losing a sizable amount of his income. This comprised an alleged 50% of the real estate and 25% of the rental revenue, equal to a total of roughly $250,000. Derby couldn't take the violence anymore and was scared that Fred was going to hurt her. He was not the type to remain silent when it came to money. Eventually, the situation got heated. Derby had no idea how the custody agreement would play out because everything was still quite new. Therefore, she granted permission for Fred to take the girls on alternate weekends. But Fred was vengeful, and he had other plans. On January 21, 1987, Derby was getting ready to take the girls to their father. Fred came there and battered Derby in front of both young girls, aged 3 and 7. They were very frightened. He choked Derby till she passed out. 5 days later, she applied for a temporary restraining order against him. A few weeks later, he was also arrested for battery. Things were quickly getting out of control. She felt like she had to run away to stay alive. Derby worked so hard to improve her life. She was working tirelessly to ensure that her daughters had a good life ahead. She was just 28 years old, so she had a lot of time to think about their future. Derby maintained a busy schedule. She worked as a secretary at the Visiting Nurse Association of Kenosha, while also employed as a security guard for Guardian Protective Services. On weekends, she also worked as a fitness consultant at the Racine YWCA. Lately, she has applied for the position of deputy sheriff in Racine County. She intended to serve for the Racine County Sheriff's Office and eventually become a police officer. She wished to help teenagers who were in desperate situations, as well as women who were in abusive marriages. On March 21, 1987, Derby and Fred, along with their respective lawyers, had a meeting. It concluded in a way which led Derby to believe her life was at risk. Her lawyer agreed and called the authorities, requesting police protection for Derby. Barb Smith, a victim witness specialist at the Racine County District Attorney's Office, helped victims through the judicial proceedings. She recalled assisting Derby when she filed for a temporary restraining order. Smith mentioned that at the time, domestic abuse cases were not subject to obligatory arrest policies. This meant that only authorities were entitled to choose whether or not to arrest the accused. In 1987, victims were to physically go to a police station to lodge a complaint. When Derby reported about the beating, acquiring a temporary restraining order was completely another process. Smith voiced his dissatisfaction with temporary restraining orders. She viewed them as mainly ineffectual and frequently escalating the matter. She remembers telling victims that this would be the most dangerous moment for them. She highlighted that the restraining order might worsen ongoing violence. Smith could clearly recall Derby stating, "It doesn't really matter," as she left. "He's going to destroy me anyway." During that meeting on March 21st, the couple were discussing about the multiple rental estate, as well as the revenue from it that was to be divided. As per the reports, Fred cried and said, "I am very hurt. I am very hurt." He then raised a finger towards her, saying, "I do not like being hurt," as if he was threatening her. He was furious, as the separation was causing him to lose a lot of money from his rental assets. Derby was employed at the Steiberg Engineering at 1600 Gold Street as a security guard for evening duties. She patrolled the interior of the closed building, which was wrapped by a barbed wire fence. Like usual on March 21, 1987, she left her daughters with Kelly, an acquaintance who watches over her kids in her absence. Derby would repeatedly assure her that if Fred was to ever come, she would never allow him anywhere near her daughters. Kelly was the only person she trusted with her daughters, while she would go to work various jobs to support her family. This was roughly 12 hours after her dreadful sitting with Fred. Despite being deeply distressed, Derby had to keep going. Derby would typically check in with her firm around 1 a.m. That night, however, she didn't do it. The firm became suspicious when they noticed she was not answering and could not be found anywhere. At about 1:30 a.m., when the Steiberg Engineering's management was unable to find her, they contacted the police. Police arrived at Steiberg and launched a search for her and her vehicle, a Pontiac Sunbird. Nevertheless, they were unable to locate her. 7 hours later, around 8 o'clock in the morning, a policeman saw Derby's car. It was parked in an alley off 1546 Layard Avenue, just north of Steiberg Engineering. Everything seemed to be fine now, except for one disturbing detail. Blood dripped through the drainage holes from her vehicle's trunk, running down the sidewalk. Once they opened the trunk, they discovered Derby's dead body. She was fully unclothed and her mouth was sealed with white duct tape. Her throat and wrists had fatal slash marks. Her neck wounds were so deep that she was almost beheaded. Within the course of the following 24 hours, her clothing was discovered scattered over the street. Her tan uniform, security badge, and a shoulder patch from her uniform, as well as a brown shoe, were discovered. A man residing on Island Avenue discovered her ID and some other documents. The following morning, a newspaper delivery guy discovered her appointment book along the intersection of Spring Street and Highway H. Furthermore, the authorities found a set of black and red bolt cutters at the crime site. DNA analysis was still somewhat new, but all the evidence was carefully stored just according to the standard procedure. The coroner disclosed some unsettling details, which were going to construct an impression of what really transpired. When the body was discovered, Derby was still wearing all her jewelry. Therefore, she wasn't a victim of a robbery. This was eliminated as a motive. Moreover, there wasn't any indication of an assault. A forensic pathologist conducted a detailed examination. He stated that the injury to Derby's head was inflicted via bolt cutters. Investigators found out that the perpetrator gained access to the Steiberg Engineering's premises by cutting through a section of the chain-link fence at its east side. Photos from the crime scene showed a shoe print on the premises with a pointed toe that resembled a cowboy boot. Detectives then determined that this matched with the shoes that somebody she knew would use to wear. Darby had a habit of taking her girls' clothes with her to work for washing. She would routinely park her car next to the cafeteria's door to make it easier to carry the laundry basket back and forth. So the assailant likely waited for her there and, whilst she was passing by, took her by surprise. Additionally, her jacket was discovered with its sleeves inside out, indicating that somebody had tried to grab her from behind, according to an inspection. Darby struggled, was able to free herself, and ran towards the office close by, where marks on the door showed she had locked herself inside. They noticed denim marks on the door. It appeared that somebody wearing a denim jacket was pushing on the door with their shoulder. The perpetrator knocked her unconscious and then gagged her mouth with white duct tape. Then he took her to the trunk of her vehicle. The use of duct tape implied planning. Experts believe Darby's personal belongings were spread throughout town to elude the authorities. It appeared that the assailant was concerned about ending up as the primary suspect. Investigators concluded that the perpetrator drove Darby to another site, stripped her naked, and then took her life. He then returned the vehicle back to her workplace, possibly because he had to fetch his own. This had to be an act of revenge, an inhumane crime against Darby. Therefore, 3 things were for sure. First and foremost, the killer was most likely someone with a personal vengeance towards Darby. Second, it was someone she knew since they were aware of her job timings. And lastly, Darby had struggled and fought back till her last breath. A family member found out that the black and red bolt cutters and evidence belonged to nobody else but Fred Wagner Richardson. Additionally, a tip led the authorities to a vehicle that resembled Darby's. During the night of the tragedy, it was reported to be seen outside Fred's residential property on State Street. Witnesses claimed they saw somebody load something large, perhaps a rolled-up carpet, inside the trunk. Proceeding quickly, the police carried out a search warrant for the location, but they were unable to acquire sufficient evidence to charge her ex with the homicide. Meanwhile, Fred kept on insisting that he was innocent. During the investigation, investigators gathered evidence from both Steiberg Engineering and the area where Darby's vehicle was found. An RPD officer on the night shift mentioned seeing a vehicle identical to Darby's, parked at the back service door of 1212 State Street around 3 a.m. That property was owned by Fred Richardson. Tenants of the property told investigators that the basement and rear entrance where the car was parked were only utilized by the building's owner. None of the tenants had keys or access to that portion of the building. Later, the investigators found a purchase receipt for red bolt cutters, like the same ones that were taken from the crime site. Fred had made a few strange remarks to his buddies. Many of them appeared to be made up, and would later be debunked as investigators questioned different witnesses and associates of his. He apparently informed an acquaintance that he was busy for the weekend, since he would be spending time with her, his daughters. That weekend, it was supposed to be Darby's turn to have the kids, so lying about it didn't make any sense. What exactly did he wish to hide? When another friend asked for a meetup, he turned him down, saying he had been feeling unwell and planned to be in bed all weekend. Darby's brother, Brian Linder, stated that Fred was the only person with the intent to hurt his sister. Ruth Wagner, her mother, along with all of her loved ones, at multiple times, requested the law enforcement to investigate Fred. Darby's mother was deeply affected by what happened. Ruth was looking forward to the divorce. As Darby had finally gotten out of an abusive marriage and was ready to move on with her life, But now her granddaughters were deprived of the mother's love, whilst the guy, who she knew was responsible for her death, was still at large. At first, Ruth took in the two young girls, but Fred eventually filed for custody. After a protracted legal battle that lasted 2 years, he won the custody of his girls. Ruth, on the other hand, wasn't someone to stand by and do nothing, so she became an advocate for victims' rights legislation in Wisconsin. She got occupied with work as an accountant, real estate agent, and prison guard as well. From working as an office manager to a tax collector for the state, she had a great deal of experience. She did everything she could to keep herself busy and avoid having to deal with the pain of losing her daughter. She often asked the authorities to reinvestigate her daughter's case and find the answer. Days grew into weeks, weeks became months, and months eventually gave way to years. A decade had passed since the horrifying incident in the industrial alley, yet the case stayed cold. In the hopes of encouraging law enforcement, her mother commemorated her 10th anniversary. Whenever her daughter's case gained attention, the police department was met with calls and a few leads that led nowhere. Ruth planned a public vigil to raise awareness about the case. It was held in the alley where her daughter's body was found. The ceremony was scheduled for 6 p.m. on Saturday in the 1500 block of Laird Avenue. She chose a weekend to ensure that as many people as possible would attend. During the vigil, some people went to say a few words for Derby, while others were invited to share recollections of her. Ruth also added that as part of the vigil, balloons would be released. With time, Ruth had embraced the heartbreaking reality of her daughter's fate. However, she still felt a stab of grief whenever the well-intended but ill-considered phrase, "life goes on," was used. Ruth commented, "Yes, life goes on, but not as we intended. I think of her every day. I still miss her every day." She experienced a deep and long-lasting sadness because of her failure to spend more of her life with her daughter. Derby was resilient, self-sufficient, and determined to provide a better life for her 2 girls. Ruth hoped that the publicity surrounding the vigil would jog a memory. Perhaps someone would see Darby's picture on the TV and remember who she was. Or maybe they had seen Fred. Maybe someone will come forward with information. For the Racine Police Department, it was an excruciatingly obvious knowledge. They were well aware that Fred was a potential suspect, but they could not do much about it. Fred had already left Racine by that time. He had relocated to the southwestern Philippines. There, he got married once again, to a woman named Lola. His daughters grew up there beside him, and he lived a happy life. He went on to have even more children and grandchildren, one of whom he would have shared with Darby. August Wagner's daughter never got to meet her beloved grandma, and was also separated from her great-grandmother, Ruth. Fred, through his lawyer Domingo Cruz, repeatedly denied having any sort of involvement in her slaying. Cruz disputed the investigation's attention on his defendant as well, claiming it was motivated by a desperation to make an arrest. Cruz kept on legally representing Fred throughout the investigation. He expressed criticism towards the authorities for their rushed attempt at accusing his client. He believes they have overlooked other leads that might have pointed them in the direction of the actual assailant. Her adolescent girls grew up without Darby and Ruth and knew just Lola and Fred. They were under the impression that their father was wrongfully accused. At the age of 69, Ruth had retired, but she kept volunteering and going to support groups. She died in 2022, while Darby's case remained unsolved. Even so, she had made it clear in her last wishes that she wanted everyone to wear bright colors, or their favorite colors, at her burial. Instead of flowers, she asked that donations be made to the Women's Resource Center the Bethany apartments in Racine, and Madison's domestic abuse intervention services. Darby's loss in some ways made her a voice for the voiceless, yet even after she passed away, Fred's ominous remarks would remain on her memorial web page. "Karma has a way of leveling the playing field," he commented harshly. Officers teamed up with a documentary crew in 2024 who wished to investigate the case more thoroughly. Fred was once again in the United States, and they paid him a visit. Fred was 82 years old and had to use a wheelchair. Officers were led in by Fred's new wife, but Fred refused to speak with them. Alphelion, the initially assigned investigator working the case, went over everything again and from a different angle. He found nothing new. In spite of this, the team thought they had enough evidence to submit the case before the DA's office. Darby's brother, Brian Linder, said that their mother would have been pleased. Earlier in 2024, Racine PD received intel that Fred, a convicted felon, was illegally in possession of weapons. They were granted a search warrant for his rental houses. On March 28, 2024, investigators searched Fred's residence. They confiscated 4 handguns and 2 tasers. They also noticed a set of bolt cutters similar to the ones discovered at the crime scene in 1987. It was similar to the ones he purchased a month after Darby's slaying. It wasn't permitted for him to have access to weaponry. In response to these findings, an arrest warrant was granted. Within the same day, Fred was apprehended from one of his properties. He was charged with first-degree murder with intent, 4 counts of possession of a firearm by a convicted felon, and 2 counts of possession of electronic weapons. At the age of 82, Fred might spend the rest of his life behind bars. After 37 years, just would finally be served for Darby. The Racine Police Department conducted a press conference on April 5th to deliver the news. On Wednesday, April 10, 2024, Fred entered a not guilty plea in Racine County Circuit Court. He is believed to be innocent until proven guilty beyond a reasonable doubt by the legal system. Prosecutors requested for $1 million bail for Fred. The court commissioner authorized $50,000 in cash and a $50,000 signature bond. Fred paid the $50,000 in cash and then was released. Racine County District Attorney Patricia Hansen highlighted the significance of linking Fred and his possessions to the incident and its time. Investigators stated that there weren't any substantial new breakthroughs in the investigation, but did emphasize a recent shift in approach by 2 officers. District Attorney Patricia Hansen claimed that there was sufficient circumstantial evidence to move forward with the court proceedings. She underlined the importance of presenting the evidence before the court. Darby's family voiced an appeal for justice. They acknowledged the impact the circumstances had made on them. When press organizations came knocking on his door to want an interview, Fred remained silent. District Attorney Hansen was concerned that he might run away considering his connection with the Philippines. Therefore, he was required to hand over his passport. Darby's brother voiced his dissatisfaction with the system while yet expressing a sense of relief. Ellie Schmidt, Darby's aunt, stated, "I know I speak for the entire family when I express my heartfelt gratitude for all those who made it possible for us to be standing here today." She also mentioned that ideally, my sister Ruth should be the one standing here. She fought so hard and for so long for justice in her daughter's case. Todd Lauer, a Racine County investigator, stated that we have frequently asked ourselves the question, why not years ago? The case was always there. We were able to lay it out in such a way that we believed that it was a common-sense case, and it was ready to be presented to a jury for their verdict. Racine is a small town, and they weren't equipped with the means to do further detailed investigations and follow-ups. Additionally, they were aware that a grand jury would require more evidence than they previously had. Yet all of their evidence led to Fred. He had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to take her life. Justice has been delayed for a long time, 37 years. Fred was able to marry a second time, have a son with his new wife, and witness his grandchildren. Darby never had the opportunity to have any of these, since her life was cut short for the sake of his revenge. A status conference is held on July 12, 2024. After decades of elusive justice, the disturbing case of Darby Wagner Richardson remains a haunting reflection of the challenges within our criminal justice system. Despite the overwhelming evidence and the community's awareness of the likely perpetrator, he managed to evade arrest for years, raising serious questions about accountability and the effectiveness of law enforcement. Why do you think it took so long for the authorities to act, despite the clear trail leading to the suspect? Could this delay in justice be attributed more to systemic failures within our legal frameworks, or was it a matter of insufficient resources at the time? How can we ensure that such oversights are not repeated, leaving families without closure and criminals free to roam? If you find this video compelling, show your support by giving it a thumbs up, subscribing to our channel, and ringing that notification bell. By doing so, you'll stay updated about the latest investigations and mysteries. Your support means the world to us as we continue to pursue the truth in the world of cold cases.